Good afternoon, everyone. This is Building SaaS on AWS GovCloud. And as you can see, we've got a couple of speakers here. Which one do you think I am? So I'm actually backfilling, so you got the B team. I'm standing in for Jennifer Droder here. She is our lead government regions go-to-market for our partner community, but she has lost her voice. So wish her well and get better soon. Today we're going to talk a little bit about SaaS. SaaS is an important topic for us, especially in our regulated industries. We have a growing demand from a number of our regulated customers who want to manage less, want to be able to buy on demand, want to be able to inherit security as they go. So we're supporting SaaS in multiple environments, government environments, aerospace defense, our justice and public safety, healthcare, and other. Each of these could have a different compliance set of requirements, and therefore it's important to know how to build SaaS for these environments. Notable customers across that range, just a postcard placard of different regulated customers with different compliance schemes. And these vary across our regulated segments. So what are the expectations of SaaS in a regulated environment? Each different set of compliances are going to want you to address a set of data security requirements, could be encryption or control requirements, adherence to regulations and different policies, high availability and fault tolerance, redundant access and failover, simplified licensing, typically on-demand, procurement options, and operations. So let's get started. We have my glasses. So we have John Dorbin. He's a product manager for Splunk Cloud, and he is part of their compliance team and has supported building out on AWS. So welcome, John, to the stage.
Awesome. No, thank you, Mark, and Jen, I hope you feel better. So thanks, everyone. As Mark said, I'm John Dorbin. I am the offering product manager for our Splunk Cloud compliance offerings. For today's session, it's super informal. I won't talk to you for like the next 50 minutes or so. It's only about 30 minutes, right? And then after those 30 minutes, we'll do like a Q&A back here. We have some other Splunkers in the crowd today. If you have any questions or just want to know the team, feel free to come back afterwards and get to know us, right? So, as Mark said, today we're going to talk about, Splunk SaaS and our journey into AWS GovCloud, right? We're going to spend some time talking about, why we go to Splunk SaaS, why we partner with AWS GovCloud, how we work well together, right? What are some challenges we face when making this journey? And we'll talk about some best practices that we adopted when we made this move into GovCloud, right? We'll also go talk to you about some lessons learned, right, when working with GovCloud to really help, satisfy our FedRAMP and IL5 needs, right? Because that was a huge driver of moving to GovCloud in the first place. Right, so without further ado, let's kick it off. So quick show of hands, who knows what Splunk is in the first place, or who's worked with Splunk? Okay, handful of people, right? So not only do we make awesome T-shirts, right, we also make some really good software out there too, right? So we were actually founded back in 2003, right, in San Francisco. It was a little startup company. I think now we have about 8,000 employees. And at the time, right, it's interesting how Splunk got recognized. And one of those very first articles written in 2003 was Splunk was that Google of machine data. And I know we do much more than that today, right? We make more T-shirts. We actually have more products and services built on top of Splunk. But that's not a bad way to characterize and reference Splunk today, right? We are that data platform that customers help and use, to aggregate their data, to analyze their data, centralize that data, and really make some sound business decisions with that data. So really at the foundational core of it, ingest data into our platform, search across that data, let's analyze it, visualize it. Splunk will run some, great advanced analytics and machine learning on top of that data, and we'll turn that data into into action, right? If you go to our website, that's the bold things, the first things you'll see, turn data into action, right? And how we're used is truly unique to each customer and each use case, right? Depends on what data gets ingested into our platform, and really, how that customer decides to use this, what rules they run on top of it, what alerts they run on top of it, right? Some customers use this just for a security use case, right? We're pretty popular in the SIM space, right? We're the Magic Quadrant leader for SIM for the past 8 years or so, right? We're in the 92 of the Fortune 100 companies out there today, which is great. And last year, I think we're at 91, so we actually added one this year. Hopefully next year we'll add 93. So that's real quick of what Splunk is, what things we do today, who uses us, and obviously being here today, right, at a public sector summit, we do have a big presence in the public sector space, right, either to satisfy some compliance need, security need. As Mark mentioned, I am the offering product manager for our compliance offerings at Splunk, and we kind of really committed to this compliance narrative, right? We do have offerings built around HIPAA, PCI, IRAP from Australia, and FedRAMP and DoD Impact Levels 5, right? And just to set the stage, really and set the tone for this conversation too, I just wanted to quick level set of what FedRAMP and DoD Impact Levels are, because I will be talking to them about significantly more about this in this conversation, right? But for those who don't know what it is, what FedRAMP out there is that Federal Risk and Management Program. This came out of that Cloud First initiative back in 2013, right? Where cloud was determined and encouraged as that first choice when making that movement into the cloud for government organizations. And then, just like with anything else in government, came the mandate of FedRAMP and the risk and compliance around it, and ensure that no one just download any good old cloud product out there. Has to have some standard to it, and that's where FedRAMP comes into play, right? DoD impact levels, a similar story, right? Just a different tune. And that's DoD's way of, securing a baseline of security requirements used by DoD to assess the posture of cloud service providers, right? So going into next slide. I went back, my fault. How do I do this? Next. There we go. All right. So I'm going to talk about now is why SaaS? Why did Splunk make this jump into SaaS? And I don't think it's not brain science why we jumped into SaaS in the first place, right? And I think for the longest time, right, there's always that conversation of on-prem versus cloud, or cloud versus on-prem. But it's not that case anymore, right? There's cloud is some aspect to that customer's journey no matter what, right? Either they went cloud first back in 2013, or they're moving into cloud based on some more data regulatory requirements out there. Like I know President Biden just launched the executive order from last year talking about the acceleration into cloud services. Not to mention, we all went through it for the past 2 years with the pandemic and the Great Resignation, right? That added strain, has really increased and forced the acceleration into cloud, right? And pick your use case, right? I mean, we just sat in the keynote speaker yesterday, USPS, like great customer use case there. Not with us, but for moving into the cloud, right? And you can just see, for all breakout sessions this past week, there is definitely some cloud use case where customers moved and completed a mission in a significant time period, right? And good news for us and for AWS, 70% of state and local executives, cloud is now their preferred environment for mission-critical data, right? That came out of Deloitte Insights in a recent article. So you can see, everyone's moving to cloud. I think what this slide kind of communicates is that it's just they're all at different points within their digital transformation, right? Either they went cloud first back in 2003, or they're slowly moving, or they were forced to shift some of their workload into the cloud, right? They're all moving towards data transformation. But I think we all can agree on is that the volume and the velocity of data is increasing and increasingly becoming more complex, right? With the expanded attack surfaces, moving to different services and tools, that equals more points of failure, right? And we really need to partner with AWS, a dominant partner in the space that can provide all those modern tools and services, that one-stop shop, right? That modern platform to account for all this additional complexity in the space, and someone we can effectively integrate with and efficiently. And that helps us as well, because we can build great products with it. We can build products that can give immediate time to value. We can eliminate these complex infrastructure requirements and maximize values from already thin IT staff, right? So next slide here. So this is one of my favorite slides for today's presentation. I think it does a great job to kind of highlight, the complexity of SaaS versus these on-prem solutions for us, for customers, and for AWS, right? I'll be talking about shared responsibility a couple times throughout this presentation. And shared responsibility is, the ability to offload some of that complexity and responsibility to your partners, right? I know we offload some of that responsibility and share responsibility with AWS, right? They're the ones who handle the physical hardware, the data centers, right? The hypervisor down, where customers can offload some of that complexity responsibility onto us, right? And especially to like a bring your own license type of model, right? Where AWS or SaaS, we're hosted on AWS, pay as you go, a lot more nimble to complete some of these tasks, right? As you can see, like all those red items in red, in order to go BOLL or on-prem solution, you need to first manage, install, set up, have these upgrades completed, and really that's all dependent on your IT staff to complete that. And as good as your IT staff is, it's all dependent on how much your company is willing to invest into them, right? To train, recruit, retrain. It's really going to be that huge dependent factor of how well your deployment is and how long it's managed, right? So, as you can see, if you decide to go Splunk SaaS, again, just talking about how nimble and quick we are to deliver value for our customers, right? You can see we right now we're in a cadence to release new features and products in a four-week cycle versus, if you look at on-prem, you might have 1 or 2 major releases a year. So, okay. So one more slide, just again, this is more just to show, that shared responsibility model and what the benefits of moving to a SaaS type solution and how we can reduce those complexities and reduce those responsibilities. And if we added AWS to the side, you're right, it would be a whole nother thing of all things to do. They'd have 4 pages of responsibilities they do, right? Again, taking care of that physical security, providing the security on the ground around the data centers, right? Making sure our operating systems are secure and hypervisor down, right? So the whole point here is obviously to relieve our operational burden as well as our customers' operational burden. So, okay, so now we've covered the basis of why SaaS, what does Splunk do. Now let's really talk about let's talk about our journey into GovCloud, right? What went well, what didn't go well, best practices, how we kind of mesh together, right? And as everyone else in this space, right, we understood too there's a huge growing demand with public sectors transitioning into the cloud, to move their sensitive workloads into cloud, and we too needed a solution to help that transition phase, right? Either we had customers who are already in high regulatory compliant environments, or we had net new customers who were well established in GovCloud and just wanted to leverage our solution, right? And for those who are not familiar with AWS GovCloud, all right, and just a quick one-liner about that. It's a isolated environment uplift from the commercial cloud offering, where it's really dependent and met for strict regulatory and compliance requirements, right? You might hear the words ITAR, right? You move into GovCloud, little requirements for ITAR, International Traffic Arms Regulation, more or less talking about the export of data, the data that needs to stay in the United States, right? And we decided this was going to be a huge business opportunity for Splunk. Because there was at a time where no one was really doing this within AWS GovCloud, right? I think we were the very first FedRAMP data lake cloud platform offering just last year, I think. I think there's a couple more popping up. But even with IL5, I think we may be the only one authorized for IL5 right now. And we needed to partner with AWS, just kind of like I said, we needed someone to partner with to set that foundation for our modern ways forward, right? To expand our Splunk footprint, and leveraging JAB authorized high AWS GovCloud was the way to do so, right? To accelerate our FedRAMP and DoD authorizations, but it's also what sets us up for success when we move down, or I guess up this compliance path into high regulatory compliance, right? So a couple more things on this. So what did our path really look like? Well, I think we were on a good path, right? Yes, we did go with AWS GovCloud, and unfortunately, we couldn't just inherit all of their controls and attestations that come with it. I know that would be the easy way out, but again, going back to the idea of shared responsibility, right? There were responsibility of security and compliance is shared amongst, Splunk, AWS, and our customers, right? I think the saying goes, AWS provides the security of the cloud, and we have to provide the security in the cloud. So our compliance story, where did it start? And you know what? Like I said, we needed to partner with somebody that could start this process with us, but also set the long-term vision that we needed, right? And it's nice with us, we did have a good starting point with AWS commercial regions, right? We did have already a good set of best practices and processes established already with working with commercial offerings, right? We already had familiarity working with auditors, with SOC 2, HIPAA, PCI, right? And also with that, we were able to stand up, the Common Controls Framework, which we call CCF. I think other organizations also follow a similar framework and pattern. But it allows us to implement a baseline of uniform controls, implementations, ensure that we're architecting compliance services within AWS. Again, this is just to ensure that we have consistency with security best practices, right? And that's either utilizing a secure centralized IDP service, right? Limited access to GovCloud through, a proper FedRAMP vetted, right, and approved personnel, or we have just a common set of tools just to enforce automation workflows, right? And this top-down policy really became like the common understanding within Splunk, right? This was kind of our start of our backbone of maintaining compliance. So, with these built processes, right, with working with AWS and with the CCF, we are actually on a really good path to meet FedRAMP obligations, right, to satisfy the 325 controls of FedRAMP. We understand that though that didn't meet us all the way of going to GovCloud, we still need to add on top of those, right? So that's when we work with a third-party auditor and advisory service or to do our gap analysis for our commercial service into FedRAMP and what we need for IL5. And of course, they came back and said, okay, yep, you satisfy X, you still need Y. And the Y was, I hit a handful of what we worked on for Y, but a lot of it was working with FIPS, right, trying to ensure that we have the proper cryptographic modules in place that are NIST validated, but not just on the core platform itself, but for the whole suite of products that we included into our FedRAMP boundary. Included, make sure we have proper HR and access control was put into place. Where anyone accessed the system, again, was going through the proper FedRAMP vetting and was the U.S. persons, right? From a documentation standpoint, right, we go and working with the auditor and the assessor, right? We help develop a bunch of documentation to help accelerate our ATO process, our authorization process, developing SSPs, providing POAMs, right, schedule monthly reviews with their sponsored agencies. And honestly, this could have not been done without, with our partners with Coalfire, who authored that FedRAMP documentation, and Shellman, who completed that assessment, right? So a couple more things, and then I'll move to the next slide. But honestly, I just want to talk about some challenges that we faced as well when we had this partnership with AWS GovCloud and working with FedRAMP and IL5 is, some things we still face today is like who qualifies for FedRAMP and IL5. That's one of the biggest things, is who qualifies for FedRAMP in the first place or even GovCloud in the first place. It's because sometimes we have customers come to us and talk about, well, I'm a government entity, I need FedRAMP. Well, that's not 100% the case, and sometimes the other way around, right? I'm not a government entity, I don't need to worry about FedRAMP. Well, that's also not true either. It's one of those conversations we have is where's that line in the sand and how do we qualify that? Some customers will be more suitable for GovCloud and some versus more commercial. So today, like I said, we do set qualifications for that. But again, this is to ensure, one, that the customer has exactly what they need. Not sure, so to ensure, we're not over-satisfying or under-satisfying these customers. Because again, moving to GovCloud does come with a different type of price increase as well, so. Talking about, how do we manage extensions into our GovCloud boundaries, which is another big thing. So we took the route of lift and shift. So we took our commercial offering and we lifted it up and shifted it into AWS GovCloud, right? So we constantly go through the battle of how do we incrementally add new services into our boundary. And this requires, assessment and approval from our agency sponsors as well as third-party auditors, right? So I think we could have taken two approaches to either validate our full-blown product offering or just create a separate boundary, right? And we took the separate boundary because I think we were a lot faster to market that way, right? As more of a strategic approach, now we have a closer contact with our sponsor, as well as third-party agencies, to ensure that again, we're limiting our attack surface, ensuring the right services are needed for the FedRAMP environment, right? Okay, so next slide here. So how did our timeline really kind of pan out? So our initial journey started back in 2015. After 2 years working with our sponsor at the time, unfortunately, they went through a leadership change and they moved from, wanted to go to cloud and on-prem, which is fine. But soon after that, I mean, we found a new sponsor, right? And what was easy with that is that we already had that foundation built from working with the old sponsor. We had to do a simple update to ATO, and we resubmitted authorization, and then in 2019, we were authorized for FedRAMP moderate. And for those curious of why we go agency route versus JAB route, what, for FedRAMP in general, FedRAMP is difficult to work with, and JAB is not much easier to work with either. So agency, we could directly work with that agency to make sure we're building exactly what they need to, where we can scope the authorization around that agency. We have clear point of contacts now, and also we're much faster time to market, so we can start onboarding customers a lot faster, right? And agencies can leverage what we've done with our previous sponsor agency, right? And plus, JAB comes with tons of competition if everyone works with JAB, right? I think they select only 3 CSPs per quarter. And then plus you're limited to other technologies and services to use. So that was our decision on JAB. So what we support today with GovCloud and where we're at today, like I mentioned, we're at the FedRAMP moderate level for in 2019, been there since 2019. But also with an increased demand for higher compliance needs, we decided there was also a need to move into higher compliant regulatory offerings, right, such as IL5, which we GA'd last year. And with IL5, right, came a new set of challenges working with, our customers as well as GovCloud, right? Just to ensure we have the, because it came with the whole new connection request of, IL5 goes to NIPRNet requirements, traversing, the DoD cap, right? And then also added another layer of responsibility too, where, a customer, before they can onboard IL5, they must go through these things like completing their ATOs, their cloud permission to connect, right? But then again, working with AWS as partner, as modern partner, we do potentially have future plans to, help reduce or eliminate some of this work to connect much faster, right? Okay. So last 2 slides before we can all get some beer for the afternoon. So I really want to now just talk to you about, President Biden's new executive order he published last year. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with it, but I mean, this is a common conversation we have a bunch of times, and I figured it'd be appropriate to bring up at the Public Sector Summit. So for those who don't know about this executive order, it really was the mandate that agencies are going to be required to take steps to strengthen their overall cybersecurity posture, right? We all know about the SolarWinds incident a couple years back, and we don't want another one like that. So what this gives is a list of actions that need to be remediated within a given time period, right? I think there's about 8 different sections within an executive order, all ranging from how do we share threat information to enhance the supply chain, and 3 items where where Splunk and AWS GovCloud come into play and we can immediately provide value are in Section 3, modernizing federal cybersecurity, Section 7, improving and strengthen government detection, in Section 8, we improve investigative and remediation capabilities. So real quick, I'll just step through these. So Section 3, that's really just talks about how we get visibility into threats. This calls for a modern way for cybersecurity, right? Calls for zero trust, calls for acceleration in the cloud, right? Which is good news for us in AWS, right? Because we provide that solution today. We have a SaaS-based solution with AWS, right? Section 7, this is more or less talking about, early detection of cybersecurity vulnerabilities and incidents, right? Or with Splunk, we do provide these solutions, right? We do have a unified view of data using Enterprise Security, our SIEM solution, where we can run advanced analytics, machine learning, threat intel, and all of that, right, to ensure we can provide that high fidelity, true positive alerts for your environment. And then Section 8, this is exactly where AWS and Splunk work extremely well together, and this is all about the enterprise log and maturity model, what they recognize in the executive order. And then there's 4 levels to this model. The first level will be the most basic, and then each level of that maturity model ranges and becomes more sophisticated, requiring more data sources, longer retention periods, and eventually implementing UBA and SOAR capabilities. And the AWS and Splunk partnership can definitely help on those, right? We can help achieve to find those time periods, to retain those logs. We can export that data out to S3 buckets, right? And we can ensure that that data is going to be retained in a compliant manner. So, and then last but not least, I know we have about 20 minutes left, so we'll get here a little early. This is more or less just a shameless plug to our Splunk Protects website. So this is our Splunk compliance homepage, as you can see. If you want information of how we handle or maintain data privacy within Splunk, within SaaS solutions and such, what products are compliant with what regulations, you can go out to this website, or you can also enter our Splunk customer trust portal. And this is our on-demand service for everything Splunk security related. You can go out here and get our shared responsibility model for SaaS, and you can also request certifications and compliance reports with this. So that was a conclusion of our presentation for today. Like I said, we're going to we have 20 minutes left of the session for today. If you have any questions or want to meet the team, I know we have a handful of Splunkers in the audience today. If you have any Splunk questions or you just want to talk about Splunk use cases or just are a champion for Splunk, come back and we can hang out in the back for a little bit. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.